I direct the Immigrants' Rights Clinic at Stanford Law School, and it's my absolute pleasure to serve as moderator today. Let me tell you a little bit about the format that we're going to use. What I'm going to do is ask a few short questions to sort of give you a sense of the landscape of what the issues are in terms of volunteering at the border, working at the border issues, and then we can open it up for questions from all of you because we're certainly delighted to hear what concerns people have. Let me give you very brief introductions to our panelists and preface this by saying I could probably spend the entire 1.5 hours talking to you about how fantastic these panelists are, but I know that you will probably want to get to the presentation itself. So, but I will give you a brief introduction. So let me start with Bob Phillips. Bob, seated over here, has for the last 10 years had extensive experience in all aspects of the U.S.-Mexico border policy and issues. He's lived at the border in Nogales from 2006 to 2015 and directed a children's medical health clinic, providing care to approximately 2,000 children from Mexico. He's directed a community foundation and started with a Mexican foundation, a cross-border education agency called the Border Community Alliance. Bob has a BA in political science from Dartmouth and an MA in international relations from Stanford. So welcome, Bob. Next to Bob is Alma, Cota de Yanez. Alma, since 2003, has been the executive director of PSAC, a border nonprofit based in Nogales. The goal of the nonprofit is to improve the quality of border community, the community that's living at the border. She has led PSAC in many ways, and especially in becoming a leader in mobilizing resources and education in philanthropy, governmental agencies, and NGOs at the border. So welcome, Alma. And then to my left is Charlie Cutler. Charlie is the executive director of the Border Youth Tennis Exchange. Charlie received his BA in English Literature and Writing from Washington University, where he captained the tennis team from 2008 to the in 2008 to the NCAA Division III national title. After becoming the school's first 7-time All-American, Charlie spent 2 years competing professionally, achieving an ATP World Ranking, and now has been instrumental in starting a new nonprofit at the border, and he'll tell you more about it in a minute. To his left is Tony Segwick. Tony is an attorney who practiced commercial law around the world. Since 2007, he's managed his family's cattle ranch at the border. He has assisted in the development of over a dozen nonprofits at the border, providing opportunities in various ways. He has a family foundation that he leads called the Santa Fe Ranch Foundation that focuses on community education and the environment at the border. And then finally to Tony's left is Haley Millner. Haley is a student at the law school, and she co-founded the Stanford Advocates for Immigrant Rights, a student organization based in the law school dedicated to promoting and defending immigrant rights in the United States. This fall, she volunteered along with 6 other students at an immigration detention facility in Dilley, Texas, and she plans to practice immigration law after graduating from Stanford. Yay. So let's just start by getting a sense of the overall context, and maybe we can start with Bob. Bob, if you could just kind of give us a lay of the land of the issues that you see that border communities face, and I know that's really broad and includes health and environment and other issues, and everything is complicated by the Trump administration's policies. But maybe just kind of give us a bird's eye view, if you will, of some of the key issues that you see.
Good. How many of you have been to the U.S.-Mexican border?
Oh, wow.
Good. So that's a fair amount of you. How have you been to the Nogales U.S.-Mexican? Okay. The difficulty in any presentation like this is the fact that unfortunately most of our education is sadly bereft of information about the development of relations along the border, the historical context, relationships, economic, social, cultural, historical, between the United States and Mexico. So what we have found is it's really critical to kind of go back, because unfortunately we are in a time when the facts about that history and that relationship have been overlaid and obscured by information which is often inaccurate. And while we all understand that we all have our own opinions, it's not true that we can have our own facts. Unfortunately, the facts about the border are often nothing more than opinions. So just to give you a quick dash through the history, one of the things to remember about is the border that you see when you're there is a border that for 15,000 years of recorded history, people moved naturally north to south, and there were no barriers. The border region has been a mixture of different cultures, of indigenous cultures, Western European cultures, which has evolved, and people have learned to live and work together harmoniously along that border. That relationship became disrupted by the U.S.-Mexican War, and that was in 1846-48. That was the United States' first foreign excursion, or we invaded another country. Mexico had just become independent in 1821, had taken over the colonial possessions of Spain. At that point, Mexico included Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Colorado, California, Utah, Nevada, etc. It was a vast area. And the Mexican government was young, and it was just forming its political institutions when they found themselves invaded on a kind of trumped-up pretext. Ulysses Grant, the president at that time, said this was America's worst hour, its most unethical international intervention. 5,000 Americans died in that conflict. Another 15,000 died because of disease. Mexico lost approximately 10 times that amount of people. No one has ever kept that accurate count. It was so traumatic to Mexican civil and political and economic society that there were 7 governments during that 2-year period. You can imagine, if you're just forming the country, if we had been forming, the United States, and we'd been invaded by a much larger country who would basically took over our country, what that would have done to our political history. So you have that event that shaped, and Mexicans all know about that event. Their attitudes are shaped to some degree by it. Very few Americans even know that it happened. The second major event that went on, and there were a lot of things that intervened, the border was drawn first, I think, in 1829, I think was the first border. The Border Patrol, by the way, started out in, I think it was 1909. And does anybody know how the Border Patrol started out? This is my $64,000 question, which nobody's been able to answer, so I've kept $64,000. It was started to keep out Chinese. It was an anti-Asian movement. So that was the genesis of the Border Patrol. And in 1942, when the United States entered World War II, we imported, on an agreement with Mexico, 4 million workers. We all know about Rosie the Riveter, the entry of women into the workforce for the war effort, and how that led to a dramatic change in the role of women in the United States. Well, that is publicized, but what is not publicized is Juan the farm worker, because we depended upon that importation of 4 million workers to make the war effort succeed. Otherwise, we could not have fed our own country. And yet, there's little recognition of that contribution, and even worse, to add injury to insult, in 1953, we passed a wonderful law called the Wetback, Operation Wetback, and we deported 3.8 million people. 3.8 million people were forcibly deported from this country. Among them, approximately about 85,000 were American citizens. In other words, they didn't ask questions. They just picked people up and they deported them. Now, this may sound frighteningly familiar, and those who don't study history are often doomed to repeat it. So we progressed on from then to the current time. Border relationships have been shaped even further by what happened in 2011, when the border was suddenly seen as a potential entry point for terrorists. And at that point, we began to fortify our border, which started back originally in San Diego. The consequence of that was that the amount of people who died on the border escalated. There are approximately 8,000 recovered bodies on our border. And it's guessed that at least 50% more have not been recovered. So you have, just a few hundred miles from you, a scene of death and destruction which is unparalleled, but about which very little is said, and even less attention is paid. So what we want to do today is to share with you the dynamic and the good news, because there are wonderful things happening at the border, but in the context of this relationship and the exploitation that has taken on for many, many years. Because we've all found out that there's no such thing as a terrorist threat coming from Mexico. There's no such thing as the boogeyman known as an Osama bin Gonzalez. Does not exist. But yet we have policies based on that fact. It's the fact of the matter there have been at least 12 instances of terrorists who crossed the Canadian border, but we noticed that there's no wall being built along our wall with Canada. I'll leave you to deduce the reasons for that. So Jayashri, let me turn it back to you and let some of the other people fill in.
Thank you. So one of the things that I think would be really helpful is to get a sense of, you've talked about some of the issues at the border, including the human rights issues associated with crossing the border, and there are other issues as well as environmental and health among them. And I was wondering, Alma, if you could just talk about what are NGOs focusing on in Nogales in terms of cross-border issues, collaboration across the border, what are the kind of key issues that we see, and again, a little bit more sort of zooming in from that high level to one place at the border and the issues and what nonprofits are doing.
Okay, let me tell you a little bit of the history of NGOs. In Mexico, the nonprofit work was usually done through the Catholic Church. Nuns and priests, the very first nonprofits in Mexico started around 1600s. It's all hospitals and home for the leprosy and abandoned children, unwed mothers, etc. And they all had this super long name, San José de Todos los Santos de la Virgen del Espíritu Santo, and so on. Super long names that you can hardly Google now. But that's how it all started. In the last maybe 20 years, we, as in the rest of the world, we have a shortage of nuns. There are no nuns around. Most of the convents are becoming Airbnbs and museums and parks and whatever, beautiful places, especially in southern Mexico, not north of Mexico. And civil society took hands in the civil projects around the community that regard the people who have the less resources. And I don't want to go into the name of being poor or being underserved. They know they are poor and they know they are being underserved. So we are trying to change the language, and we want to move into that part of the community that has been lost in the system all over the country. So in the last 20 years, civil society in Mexico has become really, really strong, has become that part, and in Nogales too, that takes into their hands what's missing. There's a missing puzzle in the community between public funding and corporation money. Someone else was missing in the big picture. And I'm going to talk about Nogales, for example. In Nogales, the oldest nonprofit, it's a Casa Hogar. It's a kind of an orphanage. It's not an orphanage anymore. Children are not orphans now. Those girls are being taken from their families due to domestic violence, neglect, abuse, etc. And this house has been supported since day one in the last 92 years with funding from both sides of the border. One of the main business people in Nogales, Arizona, started supporting it with one of the wealthiest men in Nogales, Sonora. They were friends, they would cross the border every day, and they started supporting this house. They still do, their grandchildren still do, but in the way of having a US-based nonprofit, tax-deductible, 501c3k, having a tax-deductible organization on the Mexican side. It used to be, 30 years ago, it will be cash for the nuns to feed the children, to pay the electricity bill, and so on. It's now completely different. You have to have someone that will be there 24/7, an executive director to do all the grant writing and paperwork that you need. You have to have a psychologist, you have to have a tutor that will go do the after-school thing. Forget about a few nuns taking care of the girls. That has disappeared from the face of the earth. It doesn't work that way now. Those nonprofits are now social businesses. And when we see the new outcomes of Casa Hogar, for example, we're very proud to say that we have 3 girls going to college, attending college at this moment, and we have 2 of them who are college graduates. Why? Because they established their own bylaws. Differently from other kind of those homes around the country where the girls had to leave when they turned 12. Imagine you were taken from your family for those different reasons, and then at age 12 you are moved from the house you know as home and put somewhere else in the country that has room for you. Those of us who have had children, boys and girls, you know how difficult you are when you are 13, 14, 15. So you don't want to have 48 difficult girls at the same time from different backgrounds, etc. So this house, in their bylaws, it's written that no one has to leave. 13, 14, they grow up. It's the only one in the state like that, and in the country. Where the girls, once they turn 18, they're free to leave. We had one 2 years ago that decided to move on with friends she met at school, which is what you all do when you are 20, 21. She's not married, and she has a baby, and she comes to the Castle Garden every afternoon, Sunday, to throw the girls and help around. She knows what it means to be a Castle Garden girl. She was there, she arrived there when she was 1. That's all she knew. So part of this effort to bring the nonprofits, and I'm going to talk about migration a little bit with it, it's those nonprofits filling this gap into the community are having people who have the same issue. A grassroots group of 2 mothers that said to each other, okay, your son looks as weird as my son. It turned out to be autism. People knew nothing about autism in the city. 10 years ago, they were called the baptism mothers, and they thought they were preaching. No one had thought autism, baptism, well, it sounded the same thing. They had to explain to all of us from scratch what they were talking about, and then we realized that we all had someone weird in our friends, in our family, back in school. Someone was different, someone had social issues related to someone else. Now we know. So these mothers, now from 2 mothers, there are now 50 of them, 50 families. Now there are 2 groups in 2 opposite different parts of town serving the autistic and the Asperger community. And this group of mothers used to try to cross the border to have the friend of a friend of a friend of a friend adopt their child so the child could attend school. Not anymore. So when we talk about border issues, everything that we do is at some point related to migration. But on the other side, 95% of what goes on, it's not migration per se. People think about the border, it's human trafficking and drug trafficking. There's other 99% of stuff, 95% of good stuff going on. And the nonprofit network that we have been able to create and support in the last 5 years. The previous years, it was the regular, finding out lawyers and accounting firms that will help us learn. We were all learning at the same time. It was new to everyone, the nonprofit world. Remember, it was charity with nuns and priests. So in the last 5 years, we have decided to forget about charity and start talking about social investment. Having the vision of these places being like any other regular business, but instead of being for-profit. When you say non-profit, it means you're on the reds and it's okay to beg. No, we want it to be for social profit. It's a completely different perspective, moving from charity towards social investment. And these places where we have been able to get them land, local government, whenever you ask them for funding, they're always broke, but they have land, so give us land. Once we have the land secure for them, then we see who is going to build it. It's usually the Maquila Association. The Maquila is the factories on the Mexican side of the border, and the first thing we do is we do a survey and say, okay, more than 50% of the children being served here are Maquila workers. So the Maquilas have a social responsibility, if you want to name it at some point, because it makes life easier for everyone. You want to keep your workers, instead of them trying to move to Monterrey or Hermosillo because there is nothing here for their autistic child. You want to also take a look at the public schools bathrooms, because if they get hepatitis, your worker is going to get hepatitis. So at some point, the common good for the community relates in this new perspective of social investment, and that's what the network is now known for.
Thank you so much, Alma. What I thought would be useful now that we have a sense of, some of the history, some of the ways in which nonprofits formed, is to talk a little bit. I have 2 mics. To talk a little bit about 3 specific contexts where nonprofits have done creative work at the border. So maybe we can start with you, Tony, if that's okay, and talk a little bit about Santa Fe Ranch. What does Santa Fe Ranch do? How was it formed, and what are some of the volunteer opportunities there for people in the United States?
Sure. Hi. I think one of the things that you sense from Alma's conversation is how wide open that world is. How many, 5 years ago this, and that's what's awesome about the border and about border opportunities. The game hasn't been played. Yes, we are the collateral damage of policies that are based on fear. That's the legacy of 9/11. And we suffer those policies on the border. When our president calls Mexico, and the people on the border are all Mexicans or Mexican Americans, when he calls them murderers and rapists, that reinforces what Bob was talking about, that sense of what's in Spanish is called agachadismo, that sense that I have no value, no self-worth. And what we do, both the Santa Fe Ranch Foundation, which is the foundation that I run, and in many nonprofits, and I work with a lot of nonprofits, we try to create a sense of pride, a sense of achievement amongst our kids. And that is an awesome opportunity. You know, most of you looking around, your various shades of this and that, and you know, you came to this country and it was an opportunity. And when I was a younger guy, the image of my country was the Statue of Liberty. This is a nation of immigrants. And today, following 9/11, the image of borders are of barriers, of places of pain, of rejection. And so in our work down there, that's what it's about. And it's easier to work with kids. And it's not about me. I'm an old white guy. It's about the young people and the opportunities that they're going to have. And they're going to be able to succeed in those opportunities if they have some success. So one of the things, as a for instance, is we have these youth groups, and the youth groups do stuff in the community, and then we bring them up to San Francisco every year, so that they can see what the Chinese kids are doing in the back alleys of Chinatown, save the back alleys. There's a group at a place called Crissy Field under the Golden Gate Bridge. We meet with those kids, not so that my kids can learn, but so that my kids, the kids that we work with, can see that what they're doing is worthwhile. And there's lots of opportunities for you. There are organizations, you know, and if you have an interest in volunteering, if you have an interest, Charlie, who's going to talk next, he came to the border on an internship program. Nobody knew or cared that he was an awesome tennis player. And yet, as he'll tell you next, that morphed into something amazing. And so your skills, your heart, your interests are very welcome in our border.
Okay, so that's a good transition to talking, maybe to you, Charlie. No, this way.
Sorry.
And maybe, I know that you started a new nonprofit at the border, and I think what would be really helpful is just to walk through from the very beginning, kind of what was your first impression when you went there, I think as a student, right? What did you see, how did you get involved, and then what gave you the idea, and then how did you navigate, and what was specific to the border context in navigating, starting your nonprofit?
All right. So I'm Charlie. I'm the executive director of the Border Youth Tennis Exchange, which these are all board members or advisory board members that have helped get it off the ground. And I think part of the reason that I'm here is I am kind of the example that they're talking about, and the organization I've created was able to find a space in the border region because of the dynamics that Tony's mentioning and that Alma have touched on. So I guess my journey kind of began as a master's student. I came down to do an internship with Bob. He runs a lot of programs, and his organization is very well connected on both sides of the border. During this internship, I was doing research for a master's on asylum processing. So I was actually down there to research asylum narratives in a couple of the detention centers in Florence that house refugee populations. And so right off the bat, I was really engaged by the idea of narrative. You know, I participated in pro bono asylum work as an interpreter. I was very interested in kind of how narratives were transmitted and what my place as an interpreter was in that process. And so I was kind of primed for this idea that Bob and that Alma and that Tony were kind of showing me that the border is a place with a narrative as well. And it has there's truthful narratives, and there's a narrative that the community can tell you if you're actually there to ask. And then there's a larger narrative that gets talked about the border. There's a lot of words, there's a lot of dialogue that's getting talked about the border everywhere by politicians and by media. And even as someone who's a student of border policy, I was also part of that narrative that wasn't always the most truthful or compassionate way of viewing this region. That's really dynamic. So to kind of move forward a little bit, Alma connected me through this program. Alma connected me with some of her organizations that were already doing amazing work. And as kind of a random side project, I began a series of tennis lessons, just kind of for fun, to see the border, to meet new people. And I was really shocked. We gave tennis lessons for about 8 weeks, and I would have 35, 40 kids come into these lessons. Total chaos. I don't know if any of you ever taken tennis lessons, but I don't know if anyone ever learned any tennis. But I was just kind of shocked by kind of the welcome and the acceptance that I received in these communities that had never played tennis, kids that had never seen tennis. I was just kind of inspired by the potential for this type of program, just because that was my interest. It didn't have to be tennis, it could have been something else, but my thing was tennis, and my background was tennis, and I'd been coaching for years, and so that was what I brought into this space that Tony described, this open space where there's a lack of resources and a lack of innovative programming. I found a place for something that I thought could grow. And so I guess to take it one step further, because of the access I had to people like Bob and Alma and dynamic workers that were already kind of inspiring their communities and working towards local solutions to local challenges, I was able to kind of float the idea of professionalizing our program, expanding it, and using models that have existed in the States for years in order to create a program that could inspire kids, that could promote education, that could promote connection on both sides. And so from there, we've developed this infrastructure, not only to get kids involved in safe after-school recreation and academic programming, but also to use this very kind of unique and benign lens as a way, a frame I should say, as a way to connect kids across the border through this innovative work. Because if I've learned anything from them, it's that the region is one region, and the more that we can promote that exchange across the border, the stronger those communities and that civil society that Alma's talking about will be in the long run. So for me, the goal with BITE, besides giving cool programming to kids who've never had this type before, is to really use tennis as an entry point to start a new discussion and to show a different version of the border. Because frankly, a kid in Mexico learning to play tennis looks pretty similar to a kid in Arizona learning to play tennis. They're both struggling. So in general, that's kind of the space that I've tried to find on the border. And like they said, tennis is my thing. I was passionate about it. I saw the potential, and what I found, if I found anything, if you're willing to go to the border and you're willing to spend your time and you're willing to bring your own resources and really kind of carve your own path, you're going to find a ton of people who will welcome you, who will help you, who will support you, and who will integrate you into a system that's already working. A system full of smart, educated people who are already doing awesome work, and they're willing to do what they can to leverage what they can get out of you to make their community a better place.
Thank you, Charlie. So I think we all enjoyed listening to you talking about how you started your nonprofit. All of you have touched on how migration and immigration is a big part of border communities, and there are often wonderful stories like the one that you just told about border communities coming together, across the border and engaging in a shared venture and interest. But unfortunately, especially in the current climate, there's also there are a lot of asylum seekers and refugees showing up at the border, and one of the transactions, if you will, a human transaction or human experience at the border is the experience of seeking asylum. And so I was hoping, Haley, that you could talk first just a little bit about what that is. So if you take the case of somebody who is from Mexico, from Central America, and they show up at the border, take us from there to the place where you encountered them at the detention facility. And then maybe tell us a little more first.
I think it's funny that I'm going to be the one explaining what asylum law is when Jayashri is like one of the experts of the nation. But asylum is meant to protect people who fear persecution in their home countries on account of a certain group of reasons. And so my experience working with potential asylees was as Jayashri mentioned, in September, volunteered at a detention center in Dilley, Texas, which is about an hour and a half away from San Antonio, close to the border. And so I was working with a nonprofit there called CARA, C-A-R-A, and that nonprofit attempts to prepare women for what's called a credible fear interview. And the credible fear interview is, for many, the first step to decide whether you can qualify for asylum or not in this country. And the hope is if you eventually get asylum, you could become a legal permanent resident and perhaps maybe a citizen. But it's a really long path to get there, and this first step for many can be really scary. What you have to prove is that you have a credible fear of returning to your home country. And every woman that I spoke with in interviews to help prepare them for, in meetings to help prepare them for their interviews, had a story of why they were afraid. You know, these women crossed the border in really dangerous conditions, often risking their lives to come here. They didn't just come because they wanted some extra money or they, thought it might be nice to live in Texas for a while. They're running from things. And so our job, working with CARA, it was me and 6 other students, one of them's actually here, Guillermo Gomez. We volunteered for a week and we met with immigrants who were detained in this facility. And Dilley is a unique facility in a way. I mean, there are others like it, but it's for women and children, so it's a family detention center. And when you go there, it's really strange because it looks like it's supposed to be temporary, but it's been around for about, I think, 3 or 4 years. It's made of trailers, and the women and children are housed there. And the CARA Pro Bono works out of these offices in the trailers, just kind of scrambling, trying to meet with as many women as they can to prepare them for these credible fear interviews. And what preparation looks like is the CARA employees and volunteers would meet one-on-one with the women and just ask them what their life is like, ask them what they've been through and why they came here. And it's incredible, the stories that you hear. I mean, so I'm planning on practicing immigration law, so I have experience working with immigrants and hearing their stories, but there's something about the freshness of when they are just now crossing the border. Most of them entered the country within the last month. Sometimes it's usually less, but a lot of them have to go through facilities before arriving at this detention facility that are called like perreras or hieleras, which are temporary holding facilities, which have their own set of problems. But in this detention facility, they're telling their story sometimes for the first time, and so we were just trying to ask them what had happened to them and why they came, and trying to help them shape. I think, like it's been said, like the narrative is the most important thing a lot of the time for these people, because taking ownership of their story, or learning how to tell their story in the most sympathetic way or in the way that is most favorable under the law is a form of empowerment for them. What we did was work with them and help them frame their history in a way that made it clear that they were persecuted on account of one of 5 grounds, and the grounds have to do with facets of their identity. So it's not enough. A lot of them, the first thing you say is, why do you come here? And they say, por la delincuencia, like there's so much crime in my country. And we say, okay, I know that that's certainly true, and I'm not at all denying that, but that's not enough to get you asylum. You need a specific reason for why you as a person were targeted, or why you fear going back to your home country. And every time, we had, I think, like 7 interviews a day at least, each of them taking like up to a couple hours. for 5 days. So we ended up meeting with dozens of women, and every time we started with them saying something like, I mean, I guess not every time it was general, but often it was, I'm afraid of the crime in my country, I'm afraid of, the gangs. We went from that to a specific story of, well, they did kill my mother, well, they did try and extort me on the street one time. Like, every single woman had a just horrendous story that didn't come to the forefront of her mind because there's so much noise, like there's so much story and so many instances of targeting in their lives that it's sometimes hard to kind of pull those fibers out and realize why they specifically are afraid. So so my work at the border was a little bit more about how to get them to be able to stay here, but it's even though it wasn't a short-term experience, it was still equally rewarding, and getting to know these women just for a short time was incredible. But yeah.
Thank you, Kelly. So I want to talk a little bit about the opportunities for volunteering at the border, but before that, just to pause for a second, it's been about a year since President Trump was elected, and he had, the plan to get a border wall and has prototypes.
There's a wall, by the way. Most of you have been there, there's
Yes.
a wall.
To have more of a border wall and to have prototypes in the San Diego area. If you go there, you can see there's prototypes on the, near the border. And so I think it would be really helpful if you could talk a little bit about how we've seen the rhetoric here in the U.S. and on both sides, and wonderful work like what Haley's doing in addressing the needs of refugees, and those needs are only going to increase. What have been your observations about how NGOs have responded or changed, or the situation, the needs of the community have changed in this new administration? Or has there been kind of something?
I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the cross-border work that we do, because that sets us then in that area. Martini's here over there, and we have been part of a wonderful network with the University of Santa Clara since 2005. So at some point, the border is virtual. Let's say I lost my visa today, God forbid, but maybe I lost it or something. I could be here via Skype, right? Sitting right here through the computer, etc., etc. So at some point, for some kind of works and exchanges, the border is virtual because of technology. But on the other side, people who are crossing, and we have the lowest number in 25 years or 30 years. A lot of people are not risking their status. A lot of people overstay their visa, and that's Bob's language. People came here for some reasons and then overstayed their visa, but everyone had a job. And a lot of people at this moment are not willing to risk that status. And the program that we have with the University of Santa Clara is how do we empower each other in different countries regarding women's issues. And if you see what's going on in Nogales, we had the very similar experience with another woman in Uzbekistan. Most of the stuff, we just moved the map from Spanish to Uzbeki. So what we're seeing now, we are right on the spot at this minute because of the border issue. But it seems to be the rhetorical that you say is exactly the same thing in Lampedusa, Italy, getting the people from Africa, in Sarajevo, getting the people from Middle East, and so on and so on. This momentum, sometimes I feel like we are back in the 1500s. But what we see regarding the border issues about the new administration is that people are thinking twice before crossing. And let me give you a very simple example. I have always said that migration is pure business. Follow the money. The Yuma lettuce growers are the biggest in the world. And 6 months prior harvest season, they usually have 400% more people than they need with documents to work on the USA side. This year, 2 months prior harvest season, they were very worried because they had not completed their quota of workers. Young people were saying, okay, I'm attending college in San Luis Rio Colorado. I will have to cross every day, breaking my back like my father and my grandfather did. I don't want to be like my father and my grandfather. So a lot of the young people, especially from northern Mexico, when we speak of northern Mexico, it's like another Mexico, different from southern Mexico. People from southern Mexico, and maybe you saw it in Texas, it's the most numbers that are coming for agricultural and field work. cattle work. And everyone that is deported or everyone that is on their way north, you talk to them and everyone has or had a job. Everyone has someone waiting for him to at the apple orchards in Washington or at the milk farms in Wisconsin, and you name it. Everyone has a phone number and a contact that will hire them, and that's one of the reasons for migration. Everyone has something to do, or is mostly sure they will find a job, but most of them have a contact already. And the other thing about this current administration is that the academia people, the people on higher levels in business administrations, etc., are really sitting down for the first time, I think. And I'm speaking from my own example. My husband is a human resources manager for Maquila, one of the factories, and I get usually to say that I sleep with the enemy. So, we talk, and he told me that people are sitting down for the first time ever to talk openly about what could happen. This Maquila he works for, they have factories in China, Prague, Chicago, Albuquerque, Juarez, and Nogales. And their competitor, the other person in the world, the other factory in the world that manufactures that piece is in Denmark. So it's not America first. If they close the factories of all the other factories, that thing they manufacture is not going to be built here. It's going to be built in Denmark. And it's going to be 35% more expensive for you guys. And your lettuces are going to be $5. So it all comes to follow the money. And I really have all my doubts about if things are going to change that radically, or we're going to keep on blah, 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 blah. 25% of the administration is gone. The first year is gone. So we will see what really happens. But the feeling in the business sector is that the big names are really sitting down and talking about it. And that's why it has been quiet lately about NAFTA. Have you heard anything in the past 2 weeks? It's been quiet. It's big money we're talking about with NAFTA. So the rhetoric, it brings attention, it brings fear, like Tony says, and fear makes you jump. Fear makes you, nervous. But then the day goes on, and the maquilas are blooming in Mexico, and the car industry here is blooming. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. And now a lot of the people be going north that we get the opportunity to talk to in the shelters, they are all going to Texas. They've all been hired in construction. Have you heard anything about getting rates in Texas to get those people thrown up? No, they need them at this moment. For the next 5 years, they need them.
Thank you, Alma. I definitely think that some of the border, the statistics show that the number of people crossing the border from Mexico has gone down substantially, and as well that the Trump administration has said that since January to August of this year, the number of immigration-related arrests have gone up by over 40%. So those two, among other factors, are kind of balancing out the migration patterns. Let's come back to the nonprofits at the border. And Bob, I thought one thing that would be really useful is for you to just talk about one nonprofit that you worked with in getting, because I know there have been a lot of things that you've been involved with. And what are the challenges that were unique to the border context in kind of supporting the start of a new nonprofit? What were the issues that you saw? And also, what were the opportunities? Because it was something that was unique to the border context.
Yeah, the nonprofit sector is severely challenged along the border areas because of the scale and scope and the lack of resources, frankly. You're absolutely right. We have a net loss of undocumented of at least 140,000 over the last year, more than were coming in. It's down to levels, I think, in 1968. But what has also happened is the death rate is just as high as it ever was. There in the Tucson sector, there was so far this year, I think there's 165 people bodies who have been found. And that is one of the things that's happening to the nonprofits in the area, who are realizing, because of all those people who are being deported, family reunification is what drives people to take desperate steps. So yes, there are far fewer people coming over, but a lot more people are being deported. When you're on the border, you'll see these unmarked white buses coming down. If you're standing right there, you'll see them coming out. They're shackled, their arms and their legs inside the bus, just like the old chain gangs in the rural South. They're brought out with a small plastic bag with whatever is left after they've been robbed or whatever, and then they are marched across the border. And then the nonprofits that you're referring to, the Kino Border Initiative, Samaritans, No More Deaths, and all of those, are suddenly faced with the fact that all of these people who are often in desperate condition, who have families, they have children who are American citizens very often, are now desperate to get back. And the coyotes are waiting for them. I think Tony said the number when we moved to the border area in about 2006, it was like $2,000 to go, and now it's up to $6,500. So this is the level of cost, and these are people who are making, no money whatsoever. So the desperation, the nonprofits who are doing humanitarian rescue work are encountering a lot more desperate people who are attempting to cross because they want to get back to their families and their jobs. So that is new. The work that we started with the Border Community Alliance to use that was specifically to recognize that if we're going to change the narrative about the border, we have to do a couple things. First of all, we have to provide accurate information about what's going on. We have to let people know its economic and trade policies. NAFTA displaced 1.9 million workers from southern Mexico with the importation of cheap corn into an agricultural small farm area that was no longer able to compete. So the largely indigenous population moved north, just like your ancestors and mine did, to try to find work and build a future. And that's just the fact of life. So that has been, that influx has now kind of gone into limbo. One of the impacts on the communities in the border is the revenue for Mexican shoppers has dropped sharply. And also the peso has been devalued. When Teresa and I moved there, it was about 10 or 11 to 1, the ratio between peso and dollar. And then it shot up right after the election to 23 to 1. And now it's down to about 16 to 17 to 1. But that means that people are no longer coming across the shop because there's no longer an economic advantage to buy things in the United States. Nogales, Arizona has shut half of its shops right along the border in the last 6 months or so because they can't stay in business anymore. So if you want to talk about a jobs program, you've got an inverse one. So the first thing we want to do is let people know who the migrants are, where they're coming from, why they're coming. The second thing we wanted them to know was that the communities of the border that have been cut by this wall can be rebuilt if we have cross-border programs. Charlie's is a prime example. We found when Alma and I were trying to give talks to people and trying to tell them what was going on the border, we found we had to give them a personal experience. So we set up cross-border tours. And we've taken probably 600 or 700 people across in the last 6 or so years. We do a day-long immersion. All we do is we take them and show them. We introduce them to the kinds of agencies that Alma's talking about. And they are overwhelmed by the heroic work that people are doing. We take them to the Juan Bosco Centro de Migrantes, which is one family that's been in business for 35 years, taking of migrants every day. They've not closed one day, 35 years, and they've cared for over 1 million people. This is Mother Teresa kind of level, and nobody knows about it. So part of the other thing was let people know the incredible heroic things that are happening on the border, and that is the canary in the mine in terms of the implications and the results of the policies that our country has and is continuing to espouse, to show what is the real impact of that and whose advantage is it. So we started that, then we started the internship programs, Charlie at the University of San Francisco. We've had 3 Stanford Alternative Spring Break programs come down. That has been great. The Haas Center has worked with us to send other students down. We have some information out on the table. If you're interested in doing an internship at the border, we have a program for you. We have an infrastructure. The exact opportunity that Charlie has is available to all of you. And this is really an important time because that wall, like Hadrian's Wall, the Great Wall of China, is a myth. Petra Barth, who's an award-winning photographer originally from Germany, who came down, has done a marvelous book on the migrants.
Petra did a short presentation last night reminding people of somebody from Germany, that seemingly impenetrable wall that separated East and West Germany. It came down when people stopped paying attention to it. And that's really all it takes. This wall will come down, but it takes you coming to the border, studying, sharing this information, inviting organizations like ours to come tell you the facts about the border. You can make up your own mind. You can form your own opinions, but base them on the things that are actually happening there. The nonprofits there are struggling to do that, but they need help.
So Tony, maybe you could talk a little bit about, obviously with the rhetoric and concerns that people have, the law school people like to take the devil's advocate position, but the other side is concerns about border security, concerns about border safety, some of the rhetoric that we've talked about that's been very negative. How do you address, I'm sure that there are others in the ranger community in near Nogales who don't share your perspective, and what are the kinds of conversations you're having? What's effective in those conversations?
Well, that's, until these recent elections, I was a lifetime Republican and a conservative, small government guy. And that's pretty much what my colleagues in the ranching world are. Okay, we feel that government can't do anything well, and let's get government out of the way. And the thing is that government hasn't gotten out of the way. The government has gotten in the way in our country. And when you have when we become the collateral damage, if you've come down to the border in the last few years, you know that there's the real border on the border, and then 25 miles north of that, there is the virtual border. You have to go through another checkpoint. Okay, and if you're an old white guy like me, you slow down, you stop, you say U.S., you keep going. Okay, if you're a Latino, a dark-skinned guy in a used car, you get stopped, you get hassled, you get pulled over. And as a normal sort of everyday garden variety American, I have a sense of pride in my country, and that doesn't fit with it. And so when you hear the highest leader of my nation talking this baloney, this offensive way, about women, in my world, about Mexican people, it's just not right. You don't have to be, from San Francisco to know that. And so the conversations are in that regard. Alma mentioned fear. The politics of 9/11 created, the tragedies of 9/11 created a knee-jerk reaction of fear. Fear is a very powerful motivator, but it doesn't lead you to think in conversation. So one of the things that we're doing is having conversations. And I start out same place my neighbors do. We talk about the weather. Okay, we came over here and I enjoyed the rain coming on over because that's a big deal in the desert. If you guys come down and you guys become involved, I ask you to recognize that just because a guy is white and has a shotgun on the back of his pickup truck doesn't make him any less human. We're not going to get rid of white guys with pickup trucks and shotguns. What we can do is begin a conversation that Bob talked about. Let's talk about the facts. Let's talk about the fact that this wall that we've got now costs $29 billion of your and my tax money. Let's talk about the fact that Homeland Security, when it was proposed by then President George Bush, he proposed a budget of $4 billion, and President Barack Obama, and I had to explain it, and President Barack Obama in 2014 maybe proposed a budget of $94 billion. Let's talk about the waste of money that's going on. Okay, these people that get deported, they get deported in these big old white buses. So I figured, well, who's making the money? So I looked on the back, and it's somebody called Wackenhut. So I thought, I'll check them out. Well, Wackenhut is a close corporation. Whoever is getting paid that money, it's not nobody that I know, okay? And those are the kinds of conversations we have. They're not the radical, you're bad people because you're white conversations. They're conversations of inclusion, okay? They're the kind of conversations that I feel are far more effective. And one of the things that has happened with the current administration has been a strong desire not to have those conversations. It's real hard to talk to people who voted for Donald Trump. And a lot of my colleagues, guys that I ranch with, voted for Donald Trump. Now, that was a knee-jerk reaction. Those guys are beginning to see that this is a highly ineffective president, keeps on shooting himself in the foot, keeps on not getting anything done, and all of a sudden we're beginning to have more reasonable conversations, okay? And if you just give up on conversation and you say, screw you and go to hell, you don't get anywhere, It's having those conversations. It's knowing your facts. What Phillips was talking about. What's the history? What's the reality? And Alma's talking about, let's follow the money, okay? And these are the kinds of conversations that we have. And for me to come down here and talk to a bunch of, lunatic radicals is awesome. It's very refreshing, for me. No, down here, you guys. It's very refreshing because, I'm preaching to the choir. But also, when I meet with you people, it gives me hope. So that when I go back and talk to my colleagues, men that I admire and respect, men that we work together, I have your reinforcement.
So I want to make sure we have time for questions. Before we do that, maybe just a couple minutes each from Haley and Tony about just the student experience. So what's your advice to a student or someone who's advising students on how to prepare for what they can expect at a detention facility or working at a nonprofit like BITE? What's the advice that you would give them on, hey, this is the advice I wish I had known before I went to volunteer?
Gosh, how to prepare is hard because like Haley will probably tell you, you see some very troubling things, you hear some very troubling stories. That affected me a lot and actually led to some of the research I was doing because I was so self-conscious of my place within these pro bono asylum interviews. Because we are responsible for their story, because their story is told from with our words, from our lips, and because that becomes a legal document that someone's life hangs on. So in terms of preparation for that, I think understanding what you're getting to be a part of is important. But if I have any advice overall, this is advice that I actually was lucky enough to take. Basically, when I stopped playing professional tennis, and when I coached tennis for a few years, and when I decided that that's not what I wanted to do anymore, I realized I had no experience that was very relevant to any sort of job I was going to get. But that said, especially being in a place like San Francisco where I lived for 4 years, volunteering can give you that experience and can give you the opportunity to do some amazing things. If you're willing to give away your time for free, people will give you access to situations and to experiences that can really drive your career. Before moving to the border, I volunteered in these asylum cases, and I also volunteered at San Quentin. I taught college prep writing, and I actually coached the inmate tennis team there. And for someone who hadn't had that experience before, who hadn't worked in those kind of professional jobs, to me it was incredible that they would give me this type of access to start. I was in a room with 26 inmates trying to teach them, what noun verb agreement is. Before class I'm Googling what's noun verb agreement. But to tell you the truth, that was super valuable, and to have the respect of that room and to have access to that opportunity, my biggest advice is always give it away for free, because I could do a lot more interesting work in that capacity than getting some menial job. Besides that, just to take it specifically to the border, and this will kind of expand on what Tony said earlier, as far as the border goes, because of that history of violence and because of a lot of this cross-border collaboration has been kind of dampened when the drug war broke out, when things were fairly dangerous, there isn't a lot going on, like Bob said. The nonprofits are struggling, but since things have calmed down, I've actually worked very closely with the American Consulate on the Nogales Sonora side, and one of their objectives is to bring back that type of cross-border interaction, those binational nonprofit programs. And I was just shocked, again, to be someone so new to these fields with an idea, with some limited experience, to have the support of, you know, the most powerful diplomat in the region who's taken a personal stake in my organization and helping me get set up, giving me grants to start it, having me take security briefings to make me comfortable, explaining to me where I should live with my wife. I think there's a lot of opportunity for those who are willing to take it. So.
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of what Charlie said. I think really just like committing to giving up the time is probably the best advice I could give. But if once you've decided that you want to do that, I think similar to what Charlie said about realizing that you don't have a lot of experiences that sometimes can relate to what these people have gone through. I would just advise really being intentional about the way you immerse yourself in these experiences, because especially for me, like I have the impulse in a lot of these meetings with the women to just say like, oh wow, like that sounds horrible. I can imagine that would stink, but honestly I can't imagine what it would be like. So I try and correct the way that I talk to them and say, I can't even fathom what you're going through, but like I'm here for you. You know, I try and make sure that they know that I'm trying to support them without acting like I could relate to their experience, because it's really different. But yeah, I mean, just to kind of sum it up, I just agree. It's the most important to just, you know, put in the time, because I mean, even like with CARA specifically, the nonprofit that I was working with, they literally recruit volunteers for every single week anew. So we were there for 1 week. They had to already start planning. I mean, by that time, hopefully they had arranged for who was coming next, but every week they train and work with new volunteers. So they're constantly looking for people who can come work with them. And even if you can't go to the Dilly Detention Center specifically, they're looking for off-site volunteers too. They need help with their paperwork and advocacy work. So there's lots of work that needs to be done, and I think just if you can commit yourself to it, that's the best thing.
Thank you, Haley.